When did the designated driver leave everyone stranded at the party? Annie had been our designated driver since freshman year, never touched a drop of alcohol, always got us home safe no matter how messy things got. Every weekend for 4 years, her Prius was basically campus's free drunk shuttle. She'd even installed plastic seat covers because of how often people puked. That was just Annie. Always prepared, reliable, always there. I'd personally watched her save at least a dozen people from disaster. When my roommate Mike overdosed on Molly at that warehouse party, Annie recognized the signs and rushed him to the ER while we were all still arguing about whether he was just really high. She literally held his airways open in the back seat while driving with one hand. He's alive because of her. Or the time Jessica was about to go home with that senior who had multiple accusations. Annie pretended to be Jessica's angry ex and caused a whole scene to extract her. Jessica was too drunk to understand what was happening, kept calling Annie a cock-blocking bitch, but Annie just absorbed it and got her home safe. She'd stopped Brad from getting a face tattoo of his ex's name at 3 a.m., physically wrestled keys from drunk drivers, talked people off rooftops, cleaned blood, puke, and other fluids I won't mention from her car without complaint. Once she literally fought off a guy who was following drunk Sarah to her car. Got a black eye for it. Still showed up the next weekend to drive us. She'd also hidden Kevin's cocoa when cops showed up to a house party, saving him from a felony that would have ended his law school dreams. Held Anne's hair during her alcohol poisoning, monitoring her breathing for 6 hours straight instead of sleeping. The night everything changed was Cameron's birthday. February 15th, freezing cold, roads already icy from an earlier storm. We'd all gone to O'Malley's downtown. Annie was there with her usual water and lime, watching everyone's drinks, keeping track of who was too far gone. She'd already cut off Erica twice and physically removed Brad from his ex who'd shown up with her new boyfriend. I was at the bar when it happened, so I only heard about it later from the bartender who saw the whole thing. Apparently, while Annie was in the bathroom, our friend group decided they wanted Taco Bell. Cameron said he was basically sober. He'd had 8 shots and 2 lines of coke in the bathroom. They took Annie's keys from her jacket pocket. The bartender said Erica was laughing about how Annie was too controlling, and they were teaching her a lesson about being fun. They left her downtown at 1 a.m. Temperature was 18 degrees. Annie came out to find her friends gone, her jacket gone, her keys and her car gone. She called them 15 times. They sent her to voicemail every time except once. Erica finally picked up, music blasting so loud the bartender could hear it from across the room. "We're fine! Stop being such a mom!" Then hung up on her. Annie was stranded in this club downtown, alone, at the worst possible time. No buses. They'd stopped at midnight. Not enough cash for the 30-mile Uber home. The bartender said she sat at the bar for an hour trying to reach anyone else for help. Nobody answered. She spent the night in a 24-hour diner drinking coffee she could barely afford, while drunk men kept bothering her. The owner finally let her sleep in a back booth around 4 a.m. out of pity. She had hypothermia symptoms by then. Couldn't stop shaking, lips blue. At 4 a.m., Cameron crashed Annie's car going 73 in a 35 zone. Black ice, they said later, but the police report showed he was at 21 BAC with cocoa in his system. They hit a family heading home from the hospital where the father had just finished a 16-hour shift as an ER doctor. The mother, Agnes, survived, but she's paralyzed from the waist down. She was a dance teacher. The daughter, Tameka, 15 years old, was in a coma for 3 weeks. Has permanent brain damage now. Cameron got 6 months in jail. But Annie? Since it was her car and Cameron told police she always let them drive when she didn't feel like it, she got sued. Lost everything. Her savings, her scholarship when she couldn't get to student teaching. Insurance wouldn't cover it because Cameron was an unauthorized driver. She had to drop out senior year, 4 months before graduation, 4 months from her teaching degree. Here's what kills me. Not one of them are helping Annie with legal fees. Not one of them are showing up to her court dates. Erica is actually planning to testify against her. She told me she plans to tell the judge Annie frequently allowed intoxicated friends to drive. They've started a new group chat without her called Fun Friends Only. I'm the only person that Annie is still in contact with. But here's the thing. My uncle's a lawyer. I've convinced him to take this case on. These friends are about to find out what happens when you bite the hand that feeds them. I called Todd the next morning and he told me to come to his office right away. I sat across from him watching him flip through the police report, the insurance denial letter, all the paperwork Annie had tried to handle by herself. He had this way of reading where his eyes moved fast, but you could tell he was catching every single detail. Todd looked up after maybe 20 minutes and told me straight that this was going to be hard, that legal cases take time and money and energy, that he couldn't promise anything. But then he said the facts were on Annie's side if we could prove them, and that made me feel like maybe she actually had a chance. He explained that Annie's biggest problem was something called negligent entrustment, which basically means if the other side could convince a judge she had a pattern of letting drunk people drive her car, she'd be responsible even though Cameron stole her keys. I felt sick hearing that because I knew Cameron was already lying about it. Todd pulled out a yellow legal pad and slid it across the desk to me. He told me to write down everything I remembered about Annie's history as our designated driver, every single time she refused to let someone drive drunk, every time she protected us. I sat there for 3 hours filling page after page. I wrote about the time she physically wrestled keys away from Brad when he insisted he was fine to drive after 6 beers. I wrote about the night she made Cameron sleep in her car rather than let him walk home drunk in a snowstorm because she was worried he'd freeze. I wrote about the dozens of times she said absolutely not when someone suggested she was being too controlling about her keys. Every memory I wrote down made me angrier because I could see how completely the group had rewritten history to save themselves. They were acting like Annie was careless when she'd spent 4 years being the opposite of careless. Todd read through my pages and nodded, then told me he was sending formal preservation letters to everyone in the group. He explained these were legal letters demanding they not delete any texts, photos, or social media posts related to that night or their history with Annie. He sent letters to Cameron's jail, to Erica's dorm, to Brad's apartment, to Jessica's parents' house where she'd been staying since the crash. Within 2 hours, my phone started blowing up with messages from the Fun Friends group chat. They were completely panicking about lawyers and legal threats, suddenly very worried about consequences they never cared about when Annie was facing them alone. Erica sent like 15 messages calling me a traitor and saying I was ruining everyone's lives. Brad kept asking what the letters meant and if he needed to get his own lawyer. I didn't respond to any of them. 2 days later, Annie came to Todd's office to sign the papers that made him officially her lawyer. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept in a week. Her hands were shaking, so bad she could barely hold the pen. She kept apologizing for being a burden, for not having money to pay him, for causing trouble. I actually had to grab her shoulders and make her look at me. I told her she was the victim here, that Cameron and the others created this whole disaster, not her. Todd was really gentle but also firm when he talked to her. He said her biggest job right now was to stop apologizing for things that weren't her fault, because that apologizing attitude would destroy her in court. He explained that if she went into a deposition acting sorry and guilty, the other lawyers would tear her apart. After she signed the papers, Todd suggested we go to O'Malley's to talk to the bartender who was working the night of Cameron's birthday. The bar was pretty empty in the afternoon. The bartender recognized me right away, and when I mentioned Annie, his whole face changed. He remembered everything. He described Annie sitting at the bar for over an hour making frantic phone calls, her voice getting more and more panicked each time. He remembered Erica laughing about teaching Annie a lesson. He remembered the whole group stumbling out with Annie's keys while she was in the bathroom. He said he felt bad about it that night, but didn't think it was his place to get involved. Now he felt guilty because he'd watched them abandon her and didn't do anything. He agreed to write down everything he saw in a formal statement. He said he'd testify if we needed him to, because what they did to Annie was messed up, and he'd seen too many drunk drivers kill people in his 20 years working bars. Back at Todd's office, he explained our legal strategy to me and Annie. He said we weren't just defending Annie, we were going on offense. He was filing cross-claims against Cameron, Erica, Brad, and Jessica for conversion of property and negligence. Basically, we were arguing that they stole Annie's car and they were responsible for the damages, not her. The goal was to shift the blame away from Annie and force her former friends to either settle with Agnes and Tameka's family or face their own financial ruin. I loved this plan because it meant they'd finally face real consequences. That same week, I helped Annie go through 4 years of text messages on her phone and laptop looking for evidence. We found hundreds of messages. Annie saying I'm driving, period. Annie refusing to hand over keys. Annie threatening to call campus security on people who argued with her about driving. Every single message proved Cameron was lying when he said she always let them drive when she didn't feel like it. Watching Annie read her own words defending boundaries she no longer believed in completely broke my heart. She kept saying she should have been stricter, should have cut them off sooner, should have seen this coming. I kept reminding her that she did everything right and they still betrayed her. Then Dean Emmeline Walker called Annie in for a meeting about her scholarship and some student conduct review. I went with her because I didn't trust the university to be fair. Emmeline had this professional, sympathetic voice, but everything she said was about the university managing liability. She told Annie they'd frozen her financial aid pending investigation of the crash. Even if Annie could afford to stay in the school, she had no way to pay tuition now. Emmeline kept using words like optics and risk management. She said the university was worried about being sued by Agnes and Tameka's family for housing an unsafe student. Annie tried to explain that she was the victim, that her car was stolen, that she'd been the designated driver for 4 years without any problems. Emmeline nodded and took notes, but she kept coming back to optics and risk management. Then she suggested Annie might want to voluntarily withdraw for a semester to focus on healing. I knew exactly what that meant. It was code for leave before we're forced to kick you out. I watched Annie's face just crumble as she realized even the school she trusted was abandoning her. That night, Annie completely fell apart in my dorm room. She started hyperventilating and sobbing that her entire life was over. No degree, no teaching career, hundreds of thousands in debt she'd never be able to pay, and a court case where her own friends were going to lie about her. I held her while she shook and cried, and I made a decision right then. I was going to gather every single piece of evidence that proved what really happened that night. I was going to make sure everyone who abandoned her faced real consequences. I wasn't going to let them destroy her and just walk away. The next morning, I drove to the 24-hour diner where Annie spent that horrible night. I had the address from Annie's bank statement showing the coffee purchase. The place was old and worn down, stuck between a laundromat and a check-cashing store. Inside smelled like grease and burnt coffee. An older woman was wiping down the counter, gray hair pulled back in a bun. Name tag said Martha. I walked up and asked if she remembered a girl who spent the night there back in February, stranded and freezing. Martha stopped wiping and looked at me. She remembered right away. She described Annie sitting in that corner booth for hours, shaking so bad she could barely hold her phone, lips turning blue, trying over and over to reach someone. Martha said drunk guys at the counter kept bothering her, asking if she needed a ride, getting too close. Annie looked terrified. Martha finally told her she could sleep in the booth around 4 a.m. because the girl clearly had nowhere to go and the shaking was getting worse. I asked if Martha would write down what she saw and sign it. She grabbed a piece of receipt paper and wrote everything out in careful handwriting. The timeline, the blue lips, the shaking, the drunk men, letting her sleep. She signed it and dated it, and said what those friends did was cruel, and she hoped Annie was okay now. I thanked her and drove straight to Todd's office with the statement. This proved Annie was abandoned in actual danger while Cameron and the others were joyriding in her car. Todd read Martha's statement twice and added it to our evidence file. Then he told me he was ready to file the cross-claims against Cameron, Erica, Brad, and Jessica. He'd been preparing the paperwork for days. The legal strategy was simple but brutal. We were going to argue that they stole Annie's car and were responsible for all damages, not her. Force them to either settle with Agnes and Tameka's family or face financial ruin themselves. Todd filed the cross-claims that afternoon. By evening, my phone started blowing up. The legal bomb had dropped across campus. People who thought they were safe behind Cameron's jail sentence suddenly had court dates and potential liability. Erica called me at 9 p.m. screaming so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. She said we were ruining everyone's lives over a stupid mistake. I let her finish yelling and then told her that's exactly what she and the others did to Annie. The only difference was Annie didn't deserve it. Erica hung up on me. Brad texted asking what the hell was wrong with me. Jessica sent a message saying she couldn't afford a lawyer. I didn't respond to any of them. 2 days later, Bryce Dawson from the insurance company called Todd requesting a recorded statement from Annie about her history with the car. Todd shut it down immediately. He told me insurance adjusters look for any small thing they can use to deny coverage. One wrong word from Annie and they'd use it to deny everything forever. Instead, Todd sent Bryce our entire evidence package. The bartender's statement about the key theft. All the text messages showing Annie refusing to let people drive. Martha's statement from the diner. A formal letter explaining this was theft, not something called negligent entrustment. Todd made it clear Annie never gave permission, and Cameron stole her keys while she was in a bathroom. Bryce said he'd review everything and get back to us. That night, Annie woke up screaming in her dorm room. I ran down the hall because I could hear her through the walls. She was sitting up in bed crying and shaking. She told me she'd been dreaming she was in the car with Cameron, watching Agnes and Tameka's car coming toward them, unable to stop it. She kept having the same nightmare over and over. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the crash happening. She was convinced that if she'd somehow prevented her keys from being taken, none of this would have happened. I sat with her and reminded her she was in a bathroom. She called 15 times trying to stop them. She did everything possible, but survivor's guilt doesn't listen to logic. Annie just kept crying and saying she should have kept her keys in her pocket, should have never left them in her jacket, should have known better. I stayed with her until the sun came up. The social media attacks started getting worse around this time. Someone created a fake account using a variation of Annie's name and started posting what they called receipts. Screenshots of group chat messages taken out of context. Posts claiming Annie was a controlling friend who emotionally manipulated everyone and weaponized being the designated driver. The posts were carefully worded to avoid obvious lies, but they painted a picture of Annie as toxic and the group's behavior as justified. I screenshot everything with timestamps showing when the account was created and when the post went up. Sent it all to Todd. He added it to our evidence file as proof of coordinated defamation. The fake account disappeared within 24 hours, but the damage was done. People who didn't know Annie started believing she was the problem. A week later, Rohit Kumar called Todd. Rohit was the lawyer representing Agnes and Tameka. The call was professional, but you could hear the tension. Todd put it on speaker so I could listen. Rohit made it clear his clients had suffered terrible injuries and deserved full payment for their damages. Medical bills were already over $400,000. Agnes would need care for the rest of her life. Tameka had permanent brain damage. Someone needed to pay for that. Todd responded that Annie was not the responsible party and had no money anyway. She was a college student who'd been robbed. Going after her wouldn't get Rohit's clients the compensation they needed. Rohit said he understood the theft defense, but his job was to pursue every possible source of recovery. They agreed to exchange evidence and keep talking. Both of them knew a trial would destroy everyone involved. I decided to reach out to Jessica. She was the weakest link in the group. I texted her asking to meet for coffee away from the others. She agreed. We met at a place off campus where nobody from the school went. Jessica looked terrible. Dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in weeks. We talked for over an hour. I didn't push too hard at first. Just let her talk. She finally broke down crying and admitted she felt horrible about what happened to Annie. She described how Erica kept telling everyone they needed to stay unified. If anyone broke ranks and told the truth, they'd all face worse consequences. Jessica was terrified of being cut off from the friend group, but she was also losing sleep over lying about Annie. I could see her struggling between loyalty to the group and her conscience. She kept saying she didn't know what to do. I told her the truth would come out eventually, and lying in court had serious legal consequences beyond just moral ones. She left without making any promises, but I could tell she was close to breaking. The next day, Cameron's mother showed up at my dorm unannounced. She had a fruit basket and this whole speech prepared about how kids make mistakes and everyone needs to move forward. Annie was in my room and refused to see her. I went down to the lobby and intercepted the visit. I told Cameron's mother that her son stole a car while drunk and high, nearly killed 2 people, and was now trying to destroy Annie's life to avoid responsibility. She tried to argue that Cameron was a good kid who made one bad choice. I cut her off and said one bad choice that paralyzed a woman and gave a 15-year-old brain damage. She left the fruit basket with a note asking Annie to find it in her heart to forgive. We threw both directly in the trash. Todd started preparing Annie for her eventual deposition. He came to campus and we spent hours in an empty classroom running through practice questions. What was your relationship with Cameron? Did you ever let anyone else drive your car? What happened the night of the crash? Annie kept struggling because she wanted to be fair and acknowledge complexity. She'd start answers with qualifications and explanations. Todd had to teach her that depositions aren't about nuance. They're about clear, truthful answers that can't be twisted. We practiced the same questions over and over. By the end of the day, Annie could finally say, I never gave anyone permission to drive my car when I wasn't present without adding anything else. Todd said that's exactly what she needed to do. Answer the question asked and then stop talking. Don't explain, don't justify, don't provide context they didn't ask for. 3 weeks later, Emmeline sent Annie an email about the campus conduct review hearing. The university was calling witnesses including Erica, Brad, and 2 other friends. They were going to testify about Annie's pattern of controlling behavior. Todd read the witness list and immediately drafted a response to the university's legal counsel. He argued the hearing was supposed to be about stolen keys and a car crash, not Annie's personality. The university was allowing a character assassination instead of a fact-based review. Personality testimony had nothing to do with whether Cameron stole her keys. Todd's response was formal and threatening. He pointed out that allowing false testimony about Annie's character could open the university to liability. The hearing got postponed while the legal counsel reviewed Todd's objections. Annie felt relieved to have more time but also frustrated that this kept dragging on. Every day the case continued was another day she couldn't move forward with her life. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived at Annie's apartment with a law firm return address. She opened it at my kitchen table and pulled out a formal letter on expensive paper. The header read Kumar and Associates with Rohit's name listed as senior partner. Annie started reading out loud, but her voice got quieter with each line. Medical expenses already incurred $412,000. Future care costs estimated between $2.8 and $3.2 million. Pain and suffering. Loss of consortium. Loss of future earning capacity for Tameka. The numbers kept climbing. Annie made it halfway down the second page before she stopped reading completely. She just sat there staring at the wall above my sink. Her hands were still holding the letter, but she wasn't looking at it anymore. I asked if she was okay, and she didn't answer for a full minute. Todd showed up 20 minutes later because I'd texted him that Annie was shutting down. He sat across from her and waited until she finally looked at him. He told her the damages were real, and Agnes and Tameka deserved every penny listed in that letter. But then he reminded her that she didn't cause the crash. Cameron stole her car. Erica helped plan it. Brad and Jessica went along with it. They were liable for these damages, not Annie alone. Todd said we were going to make sure a judge understood that. Annie nodded, but I could tell she didn't really believe him yet. The numbers were too big. $3 million might as well have been $3 billion to someone who had $800 in savings. I spent the next week tracking down everyone Annie had ever helped. I started with Mike because I knew his story best. I texted him asking if he'd write a statement about the night Annie saved him from the overdose. He called me back within an hour. He said he'd been waiting for someone to ask because he felt horrible about what happened to Annie. Mike sent me 3 pages describing how Annie recognized his symptoms when everyone else thought he was just high. How she held his airways open with one hand while driving to the ER with the other. How the doctor told him later that he would have died without immediate intervention. He wrote that Annie never asked for thanks or recognition. She just showed up the next weekend ready to drive everyone home again like nothing happened. I saved his statement as a PDF and moved on to Sarah. She was harder to reach because she'd transferred to a different school after graduation. When I finally got her on the phone, she remembered the night Annie fought off the guy who followed her to the parking lot. Sarah wrote about being too drunk to defend herself, about Annie stepping between them and taking a punch to the face, about Annie still driving everyone home that night even though her eye was swelling shut. Sarah said she never thanked Annie properly, and the guilt had been eating at her since the crash. Kevin was the hardest conversation because he had the most to lose from telling the truth. I met him at a coffee shop off campus and explained what we needed. He stared at his cup for a long time before agreeing to write about the night Annie hid his drugs when cops showed up. He admitted Annie saved him from a felony that would have destroyed his law school applications. His statement was shorter than the others, but it was honest. Each person described Annie as someone who protected others at personal cost. Someone who set boundaries and refused to let people make dangerous choices. Todd added all 3 statements to our evidence file. He said these witnesses directly contradicted the controlling narrative Erica's group was building. They showed a pattern of Annie consistently refusing to enable risky behavior. The confrontation with Erica happened on a Thursday in the campus dining hall. I was grabbing lunch between classes when she appeared at my table with Brad and 2 other friends I barely knew. Erica demanded I stop trying to destroy everyone's future over this. She said what happened was a tragic accident. She insisted Annie needed to take responsibility for her part instead of playing victim. I pulled out my phone and started recording without saying anything. Erica kept talking, getting louder, attracting attention from nearby tables. I waited until she paused for breath and then asked her a simple question. What exactly was Annie's part in having her car stolen while she was in a bathroom? Erica's face went red. She started to answer, but then stopped. She tried again but couldn't finish the sentence without admitting they took the keys without permission. Brad jumped in saying Annie always let people borrow her car. I asked if always meant the 15 times Annie called trying to stop them that night. If always meant Annie sitting in a freezing bar for an hour with no way home. Erica called me brainwashed. She said I was ruining friendships over legal technicalities. I asked if stealing someone's keys and abandoning them in 18-degree weather was a technicality. She didn't have an answer for that either. She just grabbed Brad's arm and walked away. The 2 friends with her looked uncomfortable but followed. I saved the recording and sent it to Todd immediately. He replied saying Erica just created evidence of her own consciousness of guilt. Annie tried going to a campus support group for students dealing with trauma the following Tuesday. She'd been putting it off for weeks, but her new therapist recommended it. The group met in a basement room in the student center. Annie texted me when she got there saying there were 8 other students sitting in a circle. The facilitator asked everyone to share what brought them to group. Annie sat through stories about breakups and academic stress and family conflict. Normal college problems. When it was her turn to speak, she opened her mouth but nothing came out. She told me later she couldn't figure out how to explain that her friends betrayed her. That she was sued for millions because someone stole her car. That her entire future was destroyed through no fault of her own. The words felt too big and too shameful to say out loud. The facilitator waited patiently, but Annie just shook her head. She grabbed her bag and left the room. I got a text from her 15 minutes later. She said she couldn't handle being around people with normal problems when her life was this broken. I told her that was okay. That she didn't have to force herself into spaces that didn't fit. She didn't respond, but I knew she'd read it. Cameron called Annie from jail on a Friday afternoon. Her phone showed an automated message that the call was from a correctional facility and would be recorded. Annie stared at the screen and let it go to voicemail. We listened to the message together on speaker. Cameron's voice sounded angry and defensive. He blamed Annie for making this worse by getting lawyers involved. He insisted he told the truth about her always being cool with people driving her car. He said she needed to woman up and deal with consequences instead of trying to destroy everyone else. The recording cut off after 2 minutes. Annie looked sick. I asked if she wanted me to delete it, but she said no. Todd needed to hear this. I forwarded the voicemail to Todd and he called back within the hour. He said he'd already requested the full recording from the jail. The facility kept copies of all inmate calls. Todd explained that Cameron's entitled attitude was perfect evidence. It showed his pattern of taking without permission and expecting Annie to absorb the fallout. The recording demonstrated that Cameron still believed Annie should just accept blame and protect him from consequences. Todd said a jury would hate that attitude. Todd filed the cross claims the following Monday. He'd been preparing the paperwork for weeks but wanted all our evidence gathered first. The legal filing was 40 pages long. It laid out the entire timeline starting with Annie's 4-year history as designated driver. It included screenshots of texts where Annie refused to hand over keys, witness statements from the bartender and the diner owner, the voice memo of Jessica and Brad laughing about taking the keys, Annie's 15 unanswered phone calls, her abandonment in dangerous conditions while hypothermic. The filing argued that Cameron, Erica, Brad, and Jessica committed conversion by taking Annie's car without permission. It said they were jointly and severally liable for all damages resulting from the crash. Each defendant would be served with papers requiring them to respond within 30 days. If they didn't respond, they'd face default judgment. Todd explained that joint and several liability meant the plaintiffs could collect the full amount from any one defendant. It created pressure for the group to turn on each other. Someone would break eventually. The papers were served on Wednesday. Cameron got his copy in jail. Erica was served at her dorm. Brad got served at his apartment. Jessica was served at her parents' house. By Thursday, my phone was exploding with messages from the Fun Friends group chat. They were panicking, calling Todd's filing harassment, threatening to countersue. Todd told me to ignore them and save everything. The social media attacks got worse after the cross-claims were filed. New posts appeared calling me Annie's flying monkey. Someone accused me of harassment and stalking. A fake account was created using photos from my Instagram. The fake account posted manufactured screenshots claiming I had a history of making false accusations against innocent people. The posts spread fast. People I'd known for years started avoiding me in hallways. My group project partners in my economics class went to the professor and asked to be reassigned. They said they didn't feel comfortable working with someone involved in such a serious legal situation. The professor agreed without asking my side. I documented everything with screenshots and timestamps. I reported the fake account to campus security and to the social media platforms. Campus security said they'd investigate, but it would take time. The platform said the account didn't violate their terms of service because it wasn't directly threatening me. I sent everything to Todd anyway. He added it to our evidence file showing coordinated defamation. He said the fake account and manufactured evidence could support claims for intentional infliction of emotional distress if we wanted to pursue it. I told him I just wanted it to stop. He said it probably wouldn't until the case was resolved. People who felt cornered lashed out. Emmeline called Annie in for another meeting 2 weeks after the cross-claims were filed. Annie brought Todd this time. Emmeline suggested Annie withdraw from the university for her own well-being. She said it would allow the legal process to unfold without campus complications. Annie asked what would happen to her scholarship if she withdrew. Emmeline admitted it would be permanently forfeited. She couldn't reapply even if she wanted to return later. Todd asked Emmeline to explain the campus complications she was concerned about. Emmeline talked about publicity and potential liability, about other students feeling unsafe. Todd pointed out that Annie hadn't been charged with any crime. She hadn't been found responsible for the crash by any authority. The people who actually stole her car and caused the crash were still enrolled and attending classes. How exactly did forcing the victim to leave while the perpetrators stayed constitute fair treatment? Emmeline said the situation was complicated. Todd said it seemed pretty simple to him. He told Emmeline he'd be sending a letter to the university's legal counsel about potential discrimination. Annie left that meeting shaking, but also angry in a way I hadn't seen before. She told me she was done being pushed around by people who should have been protecting her. Charity contacted Annie the next week. She introduced herself as a victim advocate with the county attorney's office. She explained she worked with crime victims and their families to explore options beyond traditional criminal justice. Charity said Agnes had expressed interest in a restorative justice process. She wanted to meet with Annie if Annie was willing. Charity explained that restorative justice focused on accountability and healing, rather than just punishment. It would give Annie a chance to hear directly from Agnes about the harm caused. It would give Agnes a chance to ask questions and express her pain. Annie asked if she had to participate. Charity said absolutely not. This only worked if everyone chose it freely. Annie was quiet for a long time. She finally said she was terrified to face Agnes, but she also desperately wanted to take real responsibility. Not for causing the crash because she didn't give Cameron permission, but for how her car was used to hurt people. Charity said that distinction was important and they could work with it. She sent Annie information about the restorative justice process and gave her 2 weeks to decide. Annie spent the next week drafting an apology letter to Agnes. She wrote it on her laptop in my apartment because she couldn't focus in her own space. The first draft was 3 pages long and full of legal disclaimers. Annie kept trying to explain she didn't give permission while also expressing remorse. Todd read it and told her it sounded like a legal brief. Annie deleted it and started over. The second draft was too emotional. She apologized for everything, including things that weren't her fault. Todd said it could be used against her in court to show she accepted responsibility for the crash itself. Annie got frustrated and closed her laptop. She asked how she was supposed to acknowledge the harm without admitting legal fault. Todd said that was exactly the challenge. He told her to focus on the undeniable truth. Her car caused devastating harm to Agnes and to Mecca. She felt profound sorrow for their suffering. She was committed to participating in whatever accountability process was appropriate. Annie wrote 5 more drafts over the next 4 days. Todd reviewed each one. They went back and forth on specific phrases. By the end of the week, they had a final version. It was honest and humble. Annie acknowledged her car was the instrument of harm. She expressed deep sorrow for Agnes's pain. She committed to facing the consequences and participating in healing. She was clear she didn't give Cameron permission, but she didn't hide behind that fact. She owned what she could own. Todd approved it for legal safety. Annie printed it out and sealed it in an envelope. She gave it to Charity to deliver to Agnes. Then she waited to see if Agnes would agree to meet. Agnes agreed to the meeting 3 weeks later. Charity called Annie to set up the date and time. Annie spent those 3 weeks in a weird limbo between the restorative justice process and the lawsuit that was still grinding forward. Todd warned her that Agnes agreeing to meet didn't mean the lawsuit would go away. The legal system and the healing process existed on separate tracks. 2 days after Agnes confirmed the meeting, Todd called with bad news. Rohit had filed a motion to freeze all of Annie's bank accounts and assets. Todd explained that Rohit was arguing Annie might try to hide money before judgment to avoid paying damages. Annie laughed when Todd told her this. She had exactly $800 in her checking account. That was it. No savings account, no investments, no secret stash of cash. $800 was literally everything she had left after paying rent and buying groceries. Todd said it didn't matter how little she had. The motion would still freeze her accounts until the judge ruled on it. Annie felt panic rising in her chest. Those $800 were supposed to last her 2 more weeks until her next paycheck from the remote tutoring job. Without access to that money, she couldn't buy food or pay for gas or handle any emergency. Todd filed an emergency response the same day. He attached Annie's bank statements showing her financial situation. The statements painted a brutal picture. Annie had been living on ramen and pasta for weeks. Her last grocery purchase was $32. Before that, $28. Her biggest expense was rent at $450 for a tiny room in a shared house off campus. Todd's response argued that freezing Annie's accounts would cause immediate and irreparable harm. She needed that money for basic survival. The judge granted a temporary stay while reviewing the motion. Annie could access her money for now, but the threat hung over her head. The emergency hearing got scheduled for the following week. Annie couldn't sleep the night before. She kept checking her bank app on her phone to make sure the money was still there. $800 had never felt like so much and so little at the same time. The hearing took place in a small courtroom with just the judge, Rohit, Todd, and Annie present. Rohit stood up first and made his argument. He said Annie came from a middle-class family and might receive financial support from her parents that she could hide. He argued the court needed to protect his client's ability to collect on any future judgment. Todd stood up and presented Annie's bank statements on a screen. He walked through every transaction from the past 3 months. Groceries, rent, gas, phone bill, everything was there in black and white. Todd pointed out that Annie had already depleted her savings paying for basic needs after losing her scholarship. She was living paycheck to paycheck from a minimum wage tutoring job. There was nothing to hide. The judge reviewed the statements carefully. She asked Rohit if he had any evidence that Annie was receiving family support or hiding assets. Rohit admitted he didn't have evidence but said it was a reasonable precaution. The judge looked annoyed. She ruled that Rohit could freeze any assets above $5,000, but had to leave Annie enough to meet basic living expenses. Since Annie only had $800, the freeze wouldn't affect her current account. It was a small victory, but Annie felt like she could breathe again. She could at least eat while the case continued. After the hearing, I drove to the diner where Annie had spent that horrible night. Martha was working the morning shift. I explained who I was and what I needed. Martha remembered Annie immediately. She described how Annie had come in around 1 a.m. shaking, so badly she could barely hold her coffee cup. Her lips had been blue. Her hands were ice cold when Martha touched them to check. Martha said she'd seen hypothermia before, and Annie had clear symptoms. I asked Martha if she would sign a formal statement describing what she saw. Martha agreed without hesitation. She said what those kids did to Annie was wrong, and she'd be happy to help set the record straight. Todd drafted an affidavit based on Martha's account. The affidavit described Annie's physical condition in detail. Blue lips, uncontrollable shaking, visible hypothermia symptoms. It included the timeline of Annie being there from 1 a.m. until dawn. Martha also described the drunk men at the counter who kept bothering Annie and how scared she looked. One guy had tried to buy her drinks. Another had asked for her number 3 times. Martha had to tell them to leave Annie alone. The affidavit established 2 critical facts. First, Annie had been in real danger that night. Second, she had zero control over what was happening with her car. Todd added Martha's affidavit to our evidence package. Between the bartender's statement and Martha's affidavit, we could prove exactly what happened that night. Annie was a victim, not a negligent car owner. 2 days later, Annie finally got her intake appointment at the low-cost therapy clinic. The clinic was in a rundown building near campus. Annie filled out a stack of forms asking about her mental health history and current symptoms. The intake counselor was a grad student who looked barely older than Annie. She asked questions about Annie's panic attacks and sleeping problems. Annie described waking up at night unable to breathe, feeling like the walls were closing in. The counselor nodded and took notes. She gave Annie some printed handouts about coping strategies for managing panic attacks. Breathing exercises, grounding techniques, progressive muscle relaxation. She explained that the wait list for ongoing therapy sessions was 8 weeks long. Annie's face fell. 8 weeks felt impossible. The counselor said she was sorry, but the clinic was overwhelmed with students needing help. She gave Annie a crisis hotline number and told her to call if things got really bad. Annie left the clinic feeling worse than when she arrived. Even getting mental health help required resources and time she didn't have. She told me later that she felt like she was drowning, and every time she reached for something to keep her afloat, it was just out of reach. That same night, Jessica texted me. It was late, almost midnight. The text was long and rambling. Jessica said she'd been having nightmares about testifying against Annie. In the dreams, she was on the witness stand and Annie was watching her lie. Jessica would wake up feeling sick. She said she didn't think she could go through with testifying. Erica had been coaching everyone on what to say. They were supposed to claim Annie usually didn't mind when people drove her car. Erica kept texting the group saying they needed to stay strong and stick together. But Jessica's conscience was eating her alive. I read the text 3 times before responding. I wanted to push Jessica to tell the truth, but I knew she was genuinely scared. The group had a way of making people feel like traitors for breaking ranks. I remembered how hard it was for me to step away from them. I texted back that I would support whatever decision she made, but I also pointed out that lying in court could have serious legal consequences. Perjury was a crime. If Jessica got caught lying under oath, she could face criminal charges on top of everything else. I told her to think carefully about whether protecting Erica was worth risking her own future. Jessica didn't respond, but I could see she read the message. The next morning, Todd got a call from Bryce, the insurance adjuster. Bryce was requesting an examination under oath with Annie. Todd explained to me that an EUO was basically a formal interrogation under penalty of perjury. The insurance company could ask Annie whatever they wanted, and she had to answer truthfully or face charges. It was their last chance to find something they could use to deny coverage permanently. Todd spent 2 hours on the phone with Bryce negotiating the scope of the examination. Bryce wanted to ask about Annie's entire history with the car and everyone who had ever been a passenger. Todd pushed back hard. He argued they could ask about the night of the crash and Annie's general practices around lending her car, but they couldn't go on fishing expeditions into irrelevant personal details. They finally agreed on a limited scope. The EUO got scheduled for 2 weeks out. Todd told Annie to prepare for the most stressful interview of her life. One wrong answer or inconsistency could leave her personally liable for millions of dollars in damages. Annie looked terrified when Todd explained what was coming. Meanwhile, the university kept pushing Annie to leave. Emmeline called another meeting. This time, Annie brought Todd with her. Emmeline started with the same suggestion about voluntarily withdrawing for a semester. Todd cut her off immediately. He pointed out that Annie had not been charged with any crime. She had not been found responsible for the crash by any court or authority. The only thing that happened was that someone stole her car. Todd asked Emmeline directly if the university planned to expel every student who had their property stolen and used in a crime. Emmeline shifted in her seat. She said the university had to consider safety and liability. Todd asked what specific university policy Annie had violated. Emmeline pulled up the student conduct code on her computer. She scrolled through it looking for something relevant. Todd waited patiently. After several minutes, Emmeline admitted the conduct policy didn't actually support expelling Annie based on someone else stealing and crashing her car. The policy contradictions were becoming impossible to ignore. Todd suggested the university might want to reconsider its position before Annie was forced to pursue legal action for discrimination. Emmeline said she would take the matter back to the university's legal counsel. The meeting ended without resolution, but at least Annie wasn't being forced out immediately. Todd started preparing Annie for her deposition by running mock questioning sessions. He played the role of aggressive opposing counsel. He asked about Annie's relationship with Cameron. Had they ever dated? Were they close friends? Did she have romantic feelings for him? Annie stumbled, trying to explain they were just part of the same friend group. Todd stopped her. He said she needed to answer the specific question asked and then stop talking. Don't explain, don't provide context, just answer yes or no when possible. They practiced for hours. Todd asked if Annie had ever loaned her car to anyone. Annie started to say she'd let her mom borrow it once, but Todd cut her off. The question was yes or no. Yes, she had loaned her car before. To whom? Her mother. When? Last summer. Did she loan it to Cameron on February 15th? Number? Did she give him permission to drive it? Number. What was she doing when he took her keys? Using the bathroom. How long was she in the bathroom? About 5 minutes. When did she realize her keys were gone? When she came out and couldn't find her jacket. After 3 hours of practice, Annie could deliver clear, truthful, concise responses. Todd drilled her on not volunteering information and not trying to be helpful. In a deposition, helpful got you in trouble. The actual deposition took place in a conference room at Rohit's law office. Annie sat at one end of a long table. Rohit's associate, a sharp-looking woman in her 30s, sat across from her. A court reporter was positioned at the side with a stenography machine. Todd sat next to Annie. The associate started with basic background questions. Annie's full name, address, date of birth. Then she moved into Annie's history as a designated driver. How long had she been driving friends? 4 years? How many times per month on average? 2 to 4 times. Did she ever drink alcohol herself? Number. Why not? Personal choice. The questions got more specific. The associate asked about every single time Annie had driven someone home drunk. She wanted names, dates, locations. Annie provided what she could remember. The associate was trying to establish a pattern of Annie being around drunk people and enabling their behavior. But Todd had prepared for this. Every time the associate suggested Annie was enabling, Todd objected and clarified. Annie wasn't enabling drunk driving. She was preventing it by being the designated driver. After 2 hours, they took a break. Annie's hands were shaking. Todd told her she was doing great. The associate was fishing but not finding anything. They went back in. The associate pulled out printed copies of text messages. These were the messages Todd had submitted showing Annie refusing to let people drive drunk. The associate asked Annie to confirm these were her messages. Annie confirmed each one. The associate asked why Annie was so controlling about her car. Todd objected to the characterization. The associate rephrased. Why did Annie refuse to let others drive her car when she wasn't present? Annie said because it was her car and her insurance and her responsibility. The associate asked about Cameron specifically. How many times had Cameron asked to drive Annie's car? Annie said maybe 5 or 6 times over the years. How many times had she said yes? 0. Why? Because he drank heavily and she didn't trust him. The associate leaned forward. So Annie knew Cameron had a drinking problem? Yes. And she still went to bars with him? Yes, as his designated driver. Did she ever try to stop him from drinking? No, she just made sure he got home safely. The associate was trying to paint Annie as someone who enabled Cameron's drinking, but the text showed the opposite. Annie had clear boundaries. She drove people home, but she never let them drive her car. The critical moment came 3 hours in. The associate asked the key question. Did Annie give Cameron permission to drive her car on February 15th? Annie looked directly at the associate and said no, absolutely not. The associate asked how Cameron got the keys then. Annie said he stole them from her jacket pocket while she was in the bathroom. The associate asked if Annie could prove that. Annie said yes, the bartender witnessed it, and there were text messages showing she called Cameron 15 times trying to stop him. The associate asked why Annie left her keys in her jacket. Annie said because she was in a bathroom for 5 minutes and didn't expect her friends to steal from her. The associate asked if Annie accepted any responsibility for what happened. Todd objected immediately. That question called for a legal conclusion. The associate withdrew it. The deposition wrapped up after 4 hours. Annie was exhausted. Todd told her she did exactly what she needed to do. The theft narrative was now on the record under oath. 2 days after the deposition, Todd got a call from Rohit. It was off the record, just 2 lawyers talking. Rohit said the text messages had significantly complicated his case against Annie. He was still required to pursue maximum recovery for his clients, but he admitted a jury might find the theft defense compelling. Rohit suggested that if the other defendants' depositions supported Annie's version of events, there might be room for a mediated settlement. One that didn't destroy Annie financially. Todd thanked him for the call and said he'd be open to settlement discussions if the terms were fair. After he hung up, Todd called me. He said this was the first real indication that we might get out of this without Annie being buried in debt for life. Rohit was starting to see Annie as a victim instead of just a deep pocket to pursue. It wasn't over yet, but at least there was a path forward that didn't end in total financial ruin. 2 days later, Annie texted me a link to the local news website. The headline said, "Mother and daughter face long road to recovery after crash." I clicked it and immediately felt sick. There were photos of Agnes from before the crash, mid-leap in a dance studio, her body suspended in perfect form. Another photo showed her teaching a class of little kids, all of them trying to copy her movements. The article talked about how she'd run her studio for 12 years and taught hundreds of students. Then there were pictures of Tamika's artwork from before the crash, these detailed drawings of animals and landscapes that looked way too good for a 15-year-old. The article described her as an honor student who wanted to study art in college. It didn't name Annie, but it talked about the complex legal questions around who was responsible when someone's car gets stolen and used in a crash. I called Annie right away and she was crying, so hard she could barely talk. She kept saying she knew it wasn't her fault, but seeing Agnes's face and Tameka's drawings made her feel like she'd destroyed their lives with her own hands. She said she wished she'd never bought that stupid car, never agreed to drive anyone anywhere, never tried to help people who just ended up hurting her. I stayed on the phone with her for 2 hours while she cried and said she wanted to die. The next morning, Annie called Charity and asked about meeting with Agnes face-to-face. Charity explained the whole restorative justice process, how it was voluntary for both sides and focused on healing instead of just punishment. She warned Annie that Agnes might be really angry, might say painful things, might not want to forgive her at all. Annie said she understood, but she needed to look Agnes in the eye and take real responsibility for her part in what happened. Not for giving Cameron permission because she didn't, but for the fact that her car was the thing that destroyed their lives. Charity told her to write a letter to Agnes requesting the meeting and explaining why she wanted to do it. Annie spent 3 days writing and rewriting that letter. She showed me like 10 different versions. The first ones were too defensive, trying to explain that she didn't give permission and wasn't really at fault. Later versions went too far the other way, taking blame for things that weren't her responsibility. Todd had to review each draft to make sure it wouldn't hurt her in court. The final version was honest and simple. Annie wrote that she knew her car had caused terrible harm to Agnes and Tameka, that she was deeply sorry for their suffering, and that she wanted to hear directly from Agnes about what they'd been through. She said she'd participate in whatever accountability process felt right to Agnes, whether that was mediation or trial or something else. She mailed the letter through Charity and then waited. For a week, she checked her phone constantly, jumping every time it buzzed. When Charity finally called, Annie's hands were shaking so bad she almost dropped her phone. Agnes had agreed to meet. The meeting happened at a county building in a small room with a table and uncomfortable chairs. Charity sat between Annie and Agnes, explaining the ground rules. Agnes rolled her wheelchair up to the table and looked at Annie with this expression I can't even describe. Not quite anger, more like exhausted grief. She asked Annie why her friends had access to her keys if she was so careful about not letting people drive drunk. Annie explained that she kept her keys in her jacket pocket and only left them for 5 minutes while she was in the bathroom. She didn't expect the people she'd been protecting for 4 years to steal from her. Agnes asked if Annie knew Cameron had a drinking problem. Annie said yes, which is exactly why she never let him drive her car, not once in 4 years. Agnes asked how Annie could let this happen. Annie started crying and said she didn't let anything happen, that she was in a bathroom when they took her keys, that she called 15 times trying to stop them, that she was abandoned downtown in freezing weather while they crashed her car. Agnes cried too, describing how she used to dance 6 hours a day, and now she can't feel her legs. She talked about having to sell her dance studio because she can't demonstrate moves anymore. She described the pain of watching parents pull their kids from her classes because they didn't want to teach her in a wheelchair. Annie listened without trying to defend herself or make excuses. She just sat there taking it all in, bearing witness to the enormous harm. When Agnes finished, Annie said nothing she could say would make it better, but she was committed to whatever accountability was right. Charity shared an update on Tameka's condition. She'd made small improvements in physical therapy over the past few weeks. She could answer simple questions now and recognized her family members most of the time. But she'd never fully recover her brain function. She'd need supervised care for the rest of her life and would never live on her own. Agnes described having to learn how to advocate for her daughter from a wheelchair, dealing with insurance companies and medical bills while still processing her own disability. She talked about watching Tameka struggle with tasks that used to be automatic, like buttoning her shirt or remembering what day it was. The financial stress was crushing them. Medical bills were already over $400,000 and kept climbing. Agnes said she didn't know how they'd survive. Annie told Agnes she'd participate in whatever process helped them heal, whether that was mediation or trial or something else. The meeting lasted 2 hours and left both of them exhausted. 3 weeks later, the campus conduct hearing finally happened. Todd came with Annie as her advisor. The hearing room was in the administration building, a conference room with a long table where 5 panel members sat. Emmeline was there taking notes but not voting. The bartender from O'Malley's testified first, describing exactly what he saw that night. He said Erica was laughing about teaching Annie a lesson while they took her keys. He said Annie sat at the bar for over an hour making frantic phone calls and nobody answered. He remembered her because she looked so scared and abandoned. Martha from the diner testified next, describing Annie's blue lips and uncontrollable shaking when she came in around 1:30 in the morning. She said Annie kept trying to call someone but nobody picked up. She described the drunk men who kept bothering Annie and how frightened she looked. Martha said she finally let Annie sleep in a back booth around 4 because she was worried about hypothermia. I testified about Annie's 4-year history as our designated driver, all the times she refused to let anyone drive drunk, how she'd saved multiple people from disasters. I brought up the night she rushed Mike to the ER during his overdose, the time she fought off a guy following Sarah, the dozens of times she said no when people asked to drive her car. The evidence was overwhelming. Even the panel members looked uncomfortable with how wrong the university's initial assumptions had been. Then Erica testified, and her story had problems. She claimed Annie usually didn't mind when people drove her car, but couldn't explain why Annie called 15 times that night if she'd given permission. She said Annie was controlling about her car, but then admitted Annie had never actually let anyone else drive it. One panel member asked her directly if Annie gave permission that night, and Erica hesitated before saying she assumed it was okay, because Annie had been chill about it before. But we had texts showing Annie had never been chill about it, ever. Todd stood up for cross-examination and asked Erica to explain the Fun Friends Only group chat. Erica tried to deflect, saying it was just friends supporting each other after a traumatic event. Todd pressed harder. Wasn't it true the chat was created specifically to coordinate stories and exclude Annie? Erica said no, they just needed space to process what happened. So Todd pulled out his phone and read messages from the chat that Jessica had forwarded to me. Messages about staying unified and not breaking ranks and making sure everyone tells the same story. The panel members started taking notes. Erica's face went red and she said those messages were taken out of context. Todd asked what context would make coordinating false testimony acceptable. Erica didn't have an answer. One panel member asked if the chat was created before or after Annie hired a lawyer. Erica admitted it was after. Another panel member asked why they needed to coordinate their story if they were just telling the truth. Erica stammered something about being confused and scared. Her credibility was destroyed. After the hearing, Jessica found me in the hallway outside. She was crying and said she couldn't do this anymore. She told me she'd recorded a voice memo on her phone the night of the crash. I could hear her and Brad in the background laughing about taking Annie's keys and teaching her not to be such a mom. She said she'd kept it hidden because it proved they'd planned the whole thing and made everyone look terrible. But her guilt was eating her alive and she couldn't sleep anymore. I grabbed her arm and took her straight to Todd's office. He made her play the recording 3 times while he took notes. You could hear Jessica giggling and Brad saying something about Annie needing to lighten up. Someone else, maybe Erica, said, "She'll be fine. We'll bring the car back." Then Cameron's voice saying, "I'm totally good to drive. I only had like 6 shots." More laughter. The timestamp showed it was recorded at 12:47 a.m., right before they left O'Malley's. Todd asked Jessica if anyone forced her to make the recording, or if she'd edited it in any way. She said no, she'd just been recording random moments from the night like she always did at parties. She didn't even remember making it until she was going through her phone a week later. Todd asked if she'd share it voluntarily as evidence. Jessica nodded and signed a form giving permission. The voice memo was devastating proof that the key theft wasn't a drunken impulse. It was intentional. 2 days later, Todd filed a motion for partial summary judgment. The legal argument was technical, but basically said the evidence proved Annie never gave permission, and Cameron's use of her car was theft under the law. If the judge agreed, it would mean Annie couldn't be held liable under negligent entrustment theory because there was no entrustment at all, only theft. The motion included the texts showing Annie's repeated refusals, the witness statements from the bartender and Martha and Jessica's voice memo. Todd explained that if the judge granted the motion, Annie would be cleared of liability, and Cameron, Erica, Brad, and Jessica would become the sole targets for the multi-million-dollar damages Agnes was seeking. The motion put huge pressure on everyone. That same week, Bryce, the insurance adjuster, called Todd with surprising news. The insurance company's legal team had found a possible way to provide limited coverage under some weird rule about theft by household members that might extend to theft by frequent passengers. It wasn't full coverage, but it could provide a few $100,000 toward a settlement. Bryce said it wasn't guaranteed and would need tons of negotiation with the company's lawyers, but it was the first sign that Annie might not be completely destroyed financially. Todd told him to pursue it and keep us updated. The next day, Rohit called Todd and proposed a global mediation. He wanted all the defendants, the insurance company, and his clients in one room to explore settlement options before the judge ruled on the summary judgment motion. Rohit laid out the basic math. Agnes and Tamika's family needed at least $2 million to cover medical expenses and future care. That money had to come from somewhere. If Annie got cleared by the summary judgment motion, Cameron and the others would have to pay everything, and they didn't have that kind of money. If the motion got denied, Annie would be on the hook, but she didn't have money either. The only way everyone avoided total financial ruin was if they worked together to find a solution. Todd agreed to mediation. He told me later it was Annie's best chance to cap her liability at something she could actually survive, instead of facing a judgment she could never pay. The night before mediation, Annie showed up at my dorm room at 11 p.m., and I could tell immediately something was wrong. Her hands were shaking so bad she couldn't unlock her phone to show me something. She sat on my floor and just started crying. Not the quiet kind, but the gasping, hyperventilating kind where she couldn't catch her breath. I got down next to her and put my hand on her back while she rocked back and forth, saying she was going to lose everything over and over. She kept saying she'd spend the rest of her life paying for a crash she didn't cause, that nobody would believe her, that the mediator would side with Agnes because Agnes actually got hurt, and Annie just had stolen keys. I stayed on that floor with her for 2 hours while she went through every worst-case thing that could happen. Around 1 a.m., I started going through our evidence out loud, making her listen to each piece. I reminded her about the text where she said no to lending her car 15 different times. I told her about the bartender who saw Erica laughing about teaching her a lesson. I played Jessica's voice memo where they're literally joking about taking her keys. I showed her Martha's statement about finding her with blue lips and hypothermia symptoms. Every time Annie started spiraling again, I'd bring her back to the facts, the actual evidence we had. By 3 a.m., she was exhausted but calmer, lying on my floor staring at the ceiling. She told me she was ready to face whatever happened because at least she fought back instead of just accepting blame she didn't deserve. I made her sleep on my bed while I took the floor, and in the morning she looked like hell, but she was steady. The mediation happened at a conference center downtown with these long hallways and rooms with numbers on them. They put each party in a separate room, so we couldn't see Erica or Brad or Jessica or anyone else. The joint session happened first in this bigger room with a long table. Rohit stood up and described Agnes and Tameka's injuries in detail that made my stomach hurt. He talked about Agnes being a dance teacher who'd never dance again, about Tameka's brain damage and how she'd need care for the rest of her life. He said someone needed to be held accountable for their suffering, and the harm was real and permanent. Todd went next and laid out the timeline of the theft, showed the texts and the voice memo, made it clear Annie was a victim that night too. But he also acknowledged that Annie's car was the thing that hurt Agnes and Tameka, and Annie was willing to participate in a fair resolution that actually distributed responsibility to the people who caused it. The mediator was this older guy who used to be a judge, and he had this calm voice that made everything feel less scary. He explained how shuttle diplomacy works, how he'd go back and forth between rooms carrying offers and information. Then everyone split up into their separate spaces. In our private room, Todd spread out all our evidence on the table. He showed the mediator every text where Annie refused to let someone drive, every witness statement from people who saw what happened that night, Jessica's voice memo where she and Brad are laughing about taking the keys, the bartender's account of Annie being abandoned downtown. The mediator read through everything really carefully, taking notes and asking questions about specific details. After like 40 minutes, he looked up and admitted the theft defense was way stronger than he thought when he first took the case. He told us that if this went to trial, there was a real chance Annie would win on liability, but trials cost a ton of money and take forever, and you never know what a jury will do. He asked Annie what outcome she could actually live with, and she said anything that didn't leave her in debt for her whole life, and that acknowledged the truth of what happened. The mediator nodded and left to go talk to Rohit's side. He came back maybe 30 minutes later and sat down with this serious expression. He said Agnes's biggest concern right now was medical expenses and future care, not punishing people. She needed money immediately for home modifications, so she could actually get around her house in a wheelchair, for medical equipment, for Tameka's ongoing therapy and rehabilitation. The emotional justice of making sure the right people got blamed mattered to Agnes, but her practical reality was that she needed resources no matter where they came from. The mediator suggested we focus on building a settlement that gave Agnes and Tameka what they actually needed, while splitting up the liability fairly based on who was really responsible and who could actually pay. Bryce joined the mediation by phone around 2 p.m. and confirmed the insurance company would contribute $300,000 toward a settlement under some theft provision in the policy. It was way less than the full policy limits would have been if Cameron had permission to drive, but it was real money that would help close the gap between what Agnes needed and what was available. Todd jumped in immediately to make sure the insurance payment didn't count against Annie personally, that it came from the company as their contribution, not hers. Bryce agreed to that and said all parties would have to release any claims against the insurance company as part of the deal. After another hour of the mediator going back and forth between rooms, Rohit proposed a settlement structure. Insurance would pay $300,000. Cameron's family would contribute $50,000 from a college fund his parents had been saving. Erica and Brad would each contribute $25,000 from family money. Jessica would contribute $15,000. Annie's liability would be capped at $10,000 paid over 10 years at $100 a month. The total came to $420,000, which would cover Agnes's immediate medical needs, plus there'd be additional money from a victims' compensation program and Medicaid. Annie would also have to write a public apology acknowledging the harm caused by her car and expressing real remorse for what happened. The mediator came back about 20 minutes later and told us something that made me want to punch a wall. Cameron's parents initially refused to contribute anything at all. They said their son was already being punished through jail time and they shouldn't have to pay too. But when Todd threatened to go to trial and expose all the evidence about Cameron's entitled behavior and cocaine use, suddenly they found $50,000 to make the case disappear quietly. The whole thing was so frustrating because Cameron himself would pay basically nothing since he was in jail with no money or assets, but at least his family was putting something toward the harm he caused. Jessica came into our room during a break and agreed to her $15,000 contribution. She was crying and apologizing to Annie directly for the first time since the crash. She kept saying she was sorry for taking the keys, for laughing about it, for not standing up to Erica sooner. Annie just nodded and didn't say much back. Then we heard yelling from down the hall and found out Brad had stormed out of mediation, calling the whole thing extortion and saying he refused to pay a cent. That created a huge problem because without his $25,000, the settlement math didn't work, and Agnes wouldn't have enough. The mediator called for a break and went to find Brad. He came back 30 minutes later and said he'd warned Brad that if mediation failed and the case went to trial, Brad could face a judgment in the hundreds of thousands based on his role in the key theft conspiracy. While all this was happening, Todd got an email on his phone from the university. The campus conduct panel had issued its decision. Erica and Brad were placed on disciplinary probation for 2 semesters for violating the student code of conduct through theft and endangering behavior. They weren't expelled, which sucked, but they had it on their records officially. Annie was fully cleared of any wrongdoing, and her scholarship was reinstated immediately with an apology from the university for freezing it in the first place. It wasn't the punishment Erica and Brad deserved, but it was official acknowledgement from the institution that Annie was the victim, not the person responsible, and that mattered for her ability to go back to the school. After 4 hours of the mediator going back and forth between rooms, Brad finally came back and reluctantly agreed to his $25,000 contribution. The mediator had apparently made it very clear that Todd could pursue criminal conversion charges if mediation failed, and Brad's parents had apparently convinced him to just pay and be done with it. With everyone finally on board, the mediator started drafting the actual settlement agreement. Total payment of $420,000 split up exactly as Rohit proposed. Annie's personal liability capped at $10,000 over 10 years. All parties would release all claims against each other and against the insurance company. Annie would provide a written apology. The settlement terms would stay confidential so nobody could talk about who paid what. The mediator printed out copies for everyone to review and sign. Annie's hands were shaking when she picked up the pen. She read through the whole agreement twice, asking Todd questions about specific phrases and what they meant. Todd explained each section carefully and confirmed this was a fair deal given all the circumstances. Annie signed on the last page, her signature wobbly but legible. It wasn't perfect justice, and it didn't fix what happened to Agnes and Tameka, but it was something Annie could actually survive instead of spending her whole life drowning in debt for something she didn't do. 2 weeks after the settlement, Annie sat in a small conference room at the County Victim Services Center for the Restorative Justice session. Charity had set up the space with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle, tissues on the side table, and soft lighting that made everything feel less scary. Agnes rolled her wheelchair into the room with her husband pushing, and Annie's hands started shaking so hard she had to hold them together in her lap. Charity explained the process and ground rules, then asked Annie if she was ready to read her statement. Annie pulled out the folded paper she'd rewritten 17 times and started reading in a voice that kept cracking. She said her car was the tool that caused terrible harm to Agnes and Tameka, that she was deeply sorry for their pain, that she knew saying sorry couldn't fix anything, but she wanted Agnes to know she understood how serious this was. She talked about how she'd spend the rest of her life thinking about what happened and trying to live in a way that honored the weight of it. Agnes sat perfectly still through the whole thing, not interrupting, just listening with her hands folded in her lap. When Annie finished and looked up with tears running down her face, Agnes took a long breath and said she believed Annie didn't give Cameron permission to drive. But she also said she'd never fully forgive the situation, because Tameka's brain would never heal, and nothing anyone did could give her daughter back the life she was supposed to have. The honesty of it hit harder than any court verdict could have. Charity waited a moment, then shared an update about Tameka's condition. She said Tameka could now have simple conversations and recognize family members most of the time, which sounded good until Charity added that Tameka would need someone watching her for the rest of her life. Agnes wiped her eyes and described watching her daughter work so hard in therapy for tiny improvements that seemed like nothing compared to everything she'd lost. She talked about how Tameka used to dance and paint and read books way above her grade level, and now she struggled to remember what day it was. Annie asked if there was anything she could do to help, her voice barely above a whisper. Agnes looked at her for a long time, then said the best thing Annie could do was make sure her story stopped other people from letting drunk drivers hurt families. Turn the harm into something that might save someone else. Annie nodded and promised she would find a way to do that. I spent the next week writing everything down. Every detail about how Annie saved us for 4 years, how the group stole her keys and abandoned her, how they tried to destroy her to save themselves. I posted it on the campus forums and Reddit without using any names but making the pattern crystal clear. The response was crazy. Hundreds of people commented with their own stories about being used as designated drivers, about friends who took advantage, about getting blamed for things that weren't their fault. My inbox filled up with messages from people saying they'd experienced similar betrayals. 3 different campus organizations reached out asking if they could use the story in their alcohol safety programs. The health center wanted to include it in freshman orientation materials. Even the campus newspaper ran an article about designated driver exploitation without knowing it was about Annie. Watching her trauma turn into something that might actually help people felt like the first good thing to come out of this whole mess. Meanwhile, Erica's life started falling apart in the exact way she'd tried to make happen to Annie. She lost her summer internship at a big marketing firm when they ran a background check and found the disciplinary probation on her record. She posted this long, angry thing on social media about cancel culture and how one mistake was ruining her entire future. She wrote about how unfair it was that people wouldn't give her a second chance, completely missing that she'd spent months trying to destroy Annie's chances at any future at all. The comments on her post were brutal. People who knew what really happened called her out for playing victim when she was the one who stole the keys and laughed about it. Brad finished his community service requirement at a victim services organization, and I heard from mutual friends that working there actually changed something in him. He apparently stopped going to parties completely and quit drinking. Someone said they saw him volunteer at the organization even after his hours were done. It didn't erase what he did, but at least he seemed to understand the harm now. Annie re-enrolled at the university for fall semester, but only part-time. 2 classes while working as a remote teaching assistant for one of her old professors who believed her side of the story. She moved into a single room in the North Dorms, far away from where we'd all lived before, away from every memory of that year. On her first day back, she texted me a photo of her new student ID. The caption just said she was starting over for real this time. She looked exhausted in the photo, but there was something determined in her eyes that hadn't been there in months. I texted back that I knew she was going to make it, and I actually believed it. Todd finished handling all the settlement paperwork, and then called both of us to his office with an idea. He wanted to turn everything that happened into a campus safety workshop about consent and boundaries, and how to intervene when friends made dangerous choices. Annie was nervous about it at first, worried about people recognizing her story or judging her. But Todd explained we could present it in a way that protected her privacy while still teaching the important lessons. We spent 3 weeks developing the presentation with Todd's help. We covered the legal stuff about taking someone's property without permission, the ethics of respecting people who volunteer to be designated drivers, and specific strategies for stopping friends from doing stupid, dangerous things. We included real examples from Annie's case without using names. Our first workshop had 40 students show up, way more than we expected. Annie did most of the talking, explaining how it felt to be used and abandoned and then blamed. 3 people came up afterward to share their own stories about being taken advantage of as designated drivers. One girl cried while describing how her friends treated her exactly like Annie's friends had treated her. We gave her information about setting boundaries and resources for getting help. A few weeks later, Annie and I sat in my dorm room having the hardest conversation we'd ever had. We talked about how she'd spent 4 years taking care of everyone without anyone taking care of her back. How that wasn't friendship. It was just her absorbing everyone else's problems and consequences. We made a pact right there. No more doing emotional work for people who wouldn't do the same for us. No more taking on other people's bad choices as our own responsibility. No more burning ourselves out to keep other people comfortable. It sounded simple when we said it out loud, but it felt huge. The idea that we could care about people without destroying ourselves in the process. That we could have boundaries and still be good people. Annie cried a little and said she didn't know how to be any other way, but she wanted to learn. 6 months after the crash, Annie and I met at the coffee shop near campus to talk about everything that had happened. She was passing both her classes, seeing a therapist every week, slowly figuring out who she was beyond being everyone's savior. The $100 monthly payments to Agnes felt manageable, and knowing they'd end after 10 years made them feel like real responsibility, instead of punishment that would never stop. Annie said she'd never be the same person she was before. She was more careful now about who she trusted, slower to jump in and fix things, more aware of her own limits. But she was also stronger in ways she hadn't been before, clearer about what she deserved from people. We lifted our coffee cups and toasted to justice that wasn't perfect but was real, to growth that came from terrible things, and to choosing to keep going even when the path forward was complicated and hard.